Hello again, this is James Merrigan, a Things Screen podcast, and I'm back in my studio again. I found that this space is probably a better space to do this, even though the lighting is not good. This is the third attempt at this podcast because I've lost lots of things on the way. Ironically so, because the subject matter is on being lost. So last night I had done a recording of this podcast, the subject matter, and my computer crashed. And I spent about 2 hours on blogs trying to figure out how to get the computer to work again, to start up again, and then to find access into it. And after those 2 hours of research, I realized I had to erase the hard drive and everything on my computer. So I lost a lot of content. Of course, I've saved a lot of stuff on the cloud, but I know I've lost a lot of stuff. It was 4 years of putting stuff on the desktop or whatever, and I know I've lost a lot of content that I won't get back, and I really don't remember what that content is. So there was a lot of anxiety in the build-up to trying to get the computer to work again. And when I came to the point where I had to press the erase button, there was a sense of relief and release and relief. There's a Freudian slip, really, but there was a sense of release and relief. So this podcast really is about the subject on being lost, and it's something I've become more and more interested and fascinated by in terms of writing and experiencing art. So today I added to my research of yesterday, and I started to read. I read an essay by Anna Freud called it's something like On Being Lost. It was written in the mid 1950s, something like that, or before, and it took around 20 years for her to write it, and it was published later again in around 1960s. Okay, so she is a fascinating writer, a very plain spoken writer. There's no effect in her writing. It's very much about ideas rather than language as such. As you know what I mean by that. She's not self-conscious in the way she's articulating things. She's not interested in the sentence as such. She's more interested in ideas and insights, and she does that through very plain spoken language, which has really complicated ideas. So I read that essay, and it's an essay that I would say, and I would speculate, that it took her so long to write because it's very much about her father and her attachment issues with her father. Her from a position of feeling perhaps unnoticed, and so there's a degree of a lot of critical reflection. There's a lot of emotion in the text, and she is struggling. She is lost in a sense, and in that sense, the message and the medium are blended beautifully together, in that she is trying to articulate this thing that she's feeling herself, and she's doing that through a certain vernacular that it's simple, and she's not showing off. Okay. The second text I read was, and I'm going to switch cameras here in the really bad light, and this one is from a book, and it's a series of books. I have the whole series. It's called Animal Shelter, and it's published by Semiotext, which is edited by Sylvain Lottringer, and the text in it is by Kraus. Kraus was married to Sylvain Lottringer, and she was a co-editor of Semiotext, and she also wrote for them. Silver kind of took a he kind of stood backstage in terms of writing for semiotext, but he was the organizer of it. He's the founder of semiotext. He also brought in French avant-garde philosophical theory to New York and America in the 70s. And I interviewed him in of all places, Galway, at 126 Gallery at the Artist Run space about 8 years ago, with Michaela Cutia, who was a co-editor of Fugitive Papers, which we both developed around 2012, 2013, around those years. And it was the most exciting and most terrifying and intimidating process, because before we had a conversation with him in 126, I'd read all his stuff and I spent weeks reading it, and then when it came to interviewing him, I was kind of dumbfounded, because he is even more brilliant in person, I think. And it's got me to think about actually the written word versus the spoken word. When my experience with Silver that day, that when you're with him in person, he is so engaged, he is so precise, he is so, when you say something, he reacts to it and responds to it in a way that he's really listening. So it really has got me to think about those things, and I will think about these things or talk about these things through this podcast now. So back to the text. So the text is by Kraus, and it's called Something About Loss. And it opens with this letter, a real letter that she found or she salvaged from this space, this foundation, this art foundation, and where visiting artists kind of collaborated or inhabited. And she came across this letter, and it was written in 1963, and it's one of those real plain spoken letters where the writer is talking about someone they know, and they're talking about the everyday things and everything else is okay. I hope you're doing okay. One of those letters that isn't giving away too much. There's no drama in it. There's no projection of traumas going on behind the scenes. It's just it's a making contact with someone and not putting too much burden on them. Just saying that I miss you and we miss your presence. And then within the book, Kraus writes in that way that she writes, and what she's known for really is a very, once again, plain spoken, simple grammar language that translates beautifully with the letter, the introductory letter, and also what she's talking about. So she's talking about her house in LA, and in that house she doesn't stay there that much, so she has no real possession over it. So when she's off, in different countries doing different talks, being part of semiotext or whatever it is she's doing, she's away from that home most of the time, and she lets her friends stay there. So the door is always open. She says that in the text. The door is always open. But when she returns to this house, her home, she realizes small things are missing or they're displaced. And like TV remotes, things like that. And this becomes disconcerting because even though she's away most of the time, she visualizes the house as she left it. So by inviting people over, of course, that's going to be displaced, but in her head, nothing has changed. So when she comes back, even though people have been there, she's still disconcerted that things are missing and displaced. I suppose it's that experience of when you come home. I've had this experience, and some people have, where they've come home and there's been a robbery, or someone has entered the house, and even though she knows this and she's allowed this and she's invited this in, it's still disconcerting. It's still anxiety provoking. So one thing goes missing, and it's a coffee scoop. As a black plastic coffee scoop that she bought in Starbucks. And she becomes obsessed about this being missing, or anxious about it being missing. And she articulates this to Silver, who has been staying there with his girlfriend, Iris. And I suppose she felt at the time of saying it to Silver that it was a ridiculous thing to even mention. You know, there's bigger problems in the world than a black coffee scoop. But Silver acknowledges it and actually validates her. He doesn't invalidate her anxiety over this scoop. He understands that there's a fragility to this. There's a psychological fragility, and she, on his acceptance of her anxiety, nearly starts to cry, because there's a sadness and happiness in his response. Silver is also a lost object in a sense when you think about the context as an ex-husband, and he's there with his girlfriend. So there's lots of displacement within the text. Very simply put, there's no trickery in the text. She's not playing. It's not experimental fiction at all. It's very plain spoken, and that's why it makes it's a very enigmatic text. It's a text that I gave to, I was doing this collaborative project called Deep Seated, and we toured around the country. We went to Cork, we went to Limerick at Ormond House, and we went to Dublin and Temple Bar around 2016. And I invited a group of artists to be part of it, and I wanted them to talk. A lot of the texts were psychoanalytically driven, and I wanted to talk about themselves, the real selves behind the artist statement, the public artist statement. So they shared things about their personal life. It turned out in like ideas about sex and abjection and all this kind of stuff. We wanted to go right to the dirty stuff and pull that out, and I suppose it was a reaction to the cleanliness of the art scene. It was my reaction to it in a way, and I was kind of provoking them into that. So this is one of the texts I gave them to read. I want to read just a slight bit from it, or a small part from it, an extract, okay? So, I just need to take a drink. Okay, so this is a very small paragraph, but it gives you a sense of what the text is about. Where do you find a black plastic scoop? I tried searching the web, but no luck. Silver, my ex-husband, was empathetic. He and his girlfriend Iris were among those using the house. I am aware of the black plastic scoop and its fragile existence, he said. This show of support nearly moved me to tears. Silver understood, and I wondered, just how much time and care should a person spend in the attempt to replace a fetishized object? Or rather, a commonplace object that, in its absence and newly unattainable state, becomes fetishized. Although Silver was helpfully quick to point out that this desire, transferred onto an object, in fact defines the term fetish. So, this brings me, I suppose, to this idea of being lost and the fetishization of being lost, of the object. On my personal website, I have as a kind of banner over all the texts and all the content, "We are fetishists." And I've become really interested in the fetish because it's something I find really difficult to articulate to students when I'm lecturing on psychoanalysis and art in Trinity. It's the only part of the module where students become very either defensive about it in terms of the leaning towards the masculine in the fetish, you know, in the penis and all that kind of stuff. But also as just a kind of over saturated idea of what the fetish is, as this, you know, the phallic fetish. And this in popular cultures everywhere, we're saturated by it. We see a tall building and we call it phallic or fetishistic. So, or a woman's shoe, you know. So I'm interested in the fetish because of the challenges it places in front of us. And in this text, it takes the fetish away from any sexualization, any gender, and it's talked about in terms of absence. And when we lose an object, its absence becomes fetishized. So the object grows in our mind, and it becomes either more hated or more loved. I've always thought about the fetishist as someone who is unloved or can't find loved. So there's an absence of love in the fetish, and that's why there's so much projection onto it. There's an absence of something, there's something missing. So the fetish is, for me at the moment, the biggest challenge. And on being lost, you know, conflated with the fetish, has made it even more complicated. And I'm trying to transfer this over onto my own experience of art, and perhaps artists as well, how they work in this world where everything, we have to ground it in some way, and we're fearful of getting lost. And I don't mean consumed, okay? So the artist becomes consumed in their process, but I don't see that as being lost. So you can get lost in music, but that's kind of being consumed by music. You get pulled away, but you know where you stand, you're anchored, there's a way out. You also can get lost in art as a viewer, but you know there's an exit to it. Lots of artists have played with this in installation, where they pull you in a space and hopefully through experience, whether it's sound, lights, etc., that you lose yourself. But there's always a way out. You're not going to get lost in that kind of setup, because it's the architecture, you understand the architecture of it all. So there's something about being lost and the fetishization of being lost. So what I'm taking from this Kraus text is, first of all, how it's written, in this everyday vernacular, talking about the everyday, talking about a plastic coffee scoop in that terminology, and having this complexity as well, just in the way it's presented, very cleverly, I think. So all of this stuff, all these experiences of being lost, I've started to think about, you know, when we enter back into the art scene, and we start thinking about, when I start thinking about writing an art, and how the act of writing in some ways is a way of finding oneself, Whereas before, the experience of art is always about getting lost, for me anyway, or feeling awkward, feeling that I'm walking differently in the space, or feeling self-conscious. That's when I experience art with my body like that rather than my mind. I'm happiest. So, but it has brought up for me, when I write or read reviews now, I become allergic to the idea of explaining it away. Um, and I think there's something in that where we explain something for a readership that not getting it, getting lost, is the point of the whole thing. And that to reduce that to a few lines, 800 words, whatever, is becoming, for me anyway, more problematic. And that there has to be other ways in distilling this in a respectful way. And I don't think language can do that, the written word, because as writers we're so self-conscious and set within a rule-bound world, a lexical world that is filled with quotation, full stops, commas, capital letters, formatting, image, paragraphs, whatever it is. We're set within this lexicon that there's no real movement for experimentation in terms of subjectivity. And I always feel that the interaction with art is always very subjective and very personal. So how do you do that in a truer way, rather than one that the writer is standing back objectively and is not lost? So I suppose I want to get engage in things that are rambling. It's what Adam Phillips calls dawdling in the labyrinth. He has a brilliant paper on being lost as well, but it's very much about humans being dawdlers. That's our natural default state, and we are all lost, and we're trying to always create anchors to make us feel less lost. But in our natural default state, we are dawdlers, and children aren't or shouldn't be lost. So when Lucy went missing the other day, she wasn't lost at all. She was with her friend, hiding somewhere, of course. But I was lost. I was completely lost. I'll leave it there. I've went on enough. I've rambled enough. I'm lost. Thanks for listening. Until next time.